average requirement, recommended dietary allowances, and there is another metric called tolerable upper limits, which is a safe beyond which the risk of toxicity increases. So these are not, again, I just want to stress, these are not intakes but distribution of requirements. The TL is tolerable upper intake, beyond which the risk of toxicity increases, and this is derived mostly from toxicological studies. I just want to emphasize that this metric is not derived from a long-term study, mostly the acute dose related studies. Therefore, there is a lot of uncertainty associated with it. Therefore, it is always better to maintain the intakes lower than this tolerable upper limit. And the difference between ICMR 2020 and 2010 is ICMR 2010 gives a single value of RDA based on the knowledge available at that time. Even in 2020, except in the case of energy, in the case of energy only ER is specified, but not RDA because we don't want to increase the weight. And these are the definitions which I already dealt. Then you come at the physiological or dietary requirements. You see for different age groups, there is physiological requirement. I'm just taking iron as an example because many people will be interested in that. And at the very end of the presentation, I have just copy-pasted all the requirements. If someone wants to refer it to them later. You can see the physiological requirements are about 1 to 1.5 milligrams, and the absorption assumed is this, and you need this, 11 to 15 mg for adult men and women. The highest requirements are in pregnant women, and then followed by lactating women. And you see the variation that is adjusted. This is a 50th mean of the distribution, requirement distribution, and RDA is 97. That is RDA ER plus USD is the RDA. But you must remember and clearly understand that the RDA requirement is only for 2.5% of the population. 97.5% of the population require less than this value. And RDA for 2010, you can see that the single metric, it is either close to the ER or it is higher than the ER. But now current RDAs are almost always higher compared to, or closer compared to the RDA of 2010. And there is another metric of TL, which is given for all the nutrient. I'm just showing the example of iron. For adults, it is 45, and then for the infants and young children, it is 40, and then in adolescents, it is 45. Essentially, this is a population metric. This is a highest requirement for a population, and this is the intake level that one should not exceed at any time point through regular intakes. And there is another important metric, recommendations that are often ignored is the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, AMDRs, which suggests that the energy should come from carbohydrate, fat, and a quality protein in specified ratios to be in good health. And most of the time, at least to my experience, this thing is underloaded, and the micronutrients and other things are kind of high. And then how do we interpret these requirements and implications? Do these reference requirements suitable for deficient subjects? These are the questions kind of I face from among my colleagues. So I'm trying, and I thought many people would have these questions in their mind. In deficiency, the physiological requirements are higher, but the dietary requirements are low. Because, as we discussed earlier, the nutrient retention goes up, absorption goes up. Therefore, these requirements help correct, that is the ER, to a large extent, even in deficient population, but the rate of correction is very, very slow. So when you assess the benefits of health are very high in correcting the deficiency in short term, you aim to targeted therapeutic supplementation in vulnerable groups in short term. That is ideal. And the next question is how much to supplement, whether it is ER or RT. Actually, both are not, and I'll come to that little later. So, and then do these dietary requirements are cast in stone? No. This requires constant, this is contextual interpretation. For example, you see in a meal, a guava which is rich in ascorbic acid is given. You can see the bioavailability almost doubled from 9.7 to 14.2 in girls and 8.6 to 10.6 in boys. So when you put this in context of requirements, if the physiological requirement is 1.3 and we adjusted it for 8% bioavailability in the current requirements, which led us to a 15 mg of EAR. But what if the diet is very good with rich in ascorbic acid? The bioavailability, let us say, is 16%, then our requirements are 7.5 mg. Therefore, this is very, these requirements are, because of a large population, these requirements are like that. But they need to be interpreted with caution in different contexts. And you see, just another example, if you look at the physiological iron requirement in pregnancy, it is 2.55, way beyond any other physiological group. But if you look at its CR, it's not that high. That is because the bioavailability is adjusted, which is higher. And its RDA is also, closer to this because the variance is low. Quite often we are getting questions like why the RDA for pregnant women is lower than the normal woman. That is because the variance between in requirement is lower, therefore RDA will be lower. But if you look at ER, it will be higher. It is 6 milligrams higher compared to a normal woman. And again, let us consider, beta carotene is the precursor for retinol. Retinol and major portion of the vitamin A that come through a vegetarian diet is in fact from carotenoids. If you look at the dose of carotene and the carotene conversion ratio, as the intake goes up, the conversion ratio goes up. That means what? If for 1.5 mg of intake,
Hello, can't hear you.
What I want to emphasize is increasing the intake may not translate in expected benefits. It's all controlled by beautiful physiology. And then the implications of nutrient requirements. First, let's discuss my experience, at least with ICMR 2010, is the dietary deficit computed against the RDA and attempted to fill this gap through fortification or supplementation. And the statements that I often read was 70% of the population consume less than RDA. And therefore, you want to fill that gap to meet 100% RDA, but now we know that the population requirement is not the RDA, but it is ER. So based on current knowledge, the true meaning of above statement, as I feel, is 30% population consumes more than their requirement, which is actually good. We are not that deficient because 30% population is consuming more than they require. And then food fortification was decided based on the RDA, where 30 to 100% of RDA was considered for iron and or 1/3 RDA for other vitamins. But as I deal with later, neither of these metrics are suitable for fortification. Then the implication of nutrient, very, very important implication is it helps us assess what is the level of dietary inadequacy in either an individual or in a population. Let us consider a case of one particular individual. This is your requirement distribution, let us say 0 to 30. And if you know the intake of a person as 10 milligrams, and all the area under the curve, right side of this is risk of probability of deficiency. For example, this is a 5 quartile. So 85% possible that this person is likely to be at risk of deficiency. But since we don't know this individual requirement, we don't know where this particular person's requirement falls. Therefore, we should treat him with RDA because the requirement of him likely to is almost always likely to fall below this level. But this should be only in short term and it should be supervised. But the same is not the case within a population group. In a population, the requirement distribution, the intake distribution is often skewed, and it's very difficult to use a simple cut point. But it is possible where the variance in intake is higher compared to the variance in requirement. But in a large cases like what we deal with the dietary intake data, the probability of risk of inadequate intake against entire distribution needs to be measured. Many people say deficiency, risk of inadequacy with respect to ER or RT. Actually, it is risk of inadequacy equation, the probability equation has both these metrics. Therefore, we are measuring the risk of inadequacy against the entire requirement distribution. That means if the population intakes matches with ER, that is the ER, that's the requirement distribution and the intake distribution superimposed, the expected inadequacy or adequacy is 50%. But if all the population consumes at the RDA level, the expected inadequacy is 2.5% and the expected adequacy is 97.5%. I know it is tempting to push everybody to 97.5, all the population to 97.5% adequacy, but it has its own problems. I'll come to that. Now, I just discussed that if a population, let's consider a scenario of a perfect case where every individual requirement matches with their intake. That means we know 10 people, we know their intake, we know their requirement. And if we superimpose them, they exactly match. And then if we use that data to compute the probability of risk of inadequacy, it will be 50%. That itself shows that the normative value for dietary inadequacy or adequacy should be 50% in a population. And if it is not 50%, the goal of all interventions, I want to emphasize here all interventions, it could be supplementation, fortification together, is to achieve the risk of inadequacy adequacy to 50%. At least we have some data, evidence to show that if the diet, we measure the vitamin A diet, I'm sorry, I will not put the label here, but this is the vitamin A inadequacy in under 5 to 9 and 10 to 19 year children. The dietary inadequacy estimated from NNAP and NSSO data is 68, 69 and 78. And as I said, we expect 50% in normal population. Therefore, if you subtract this from that 50, it comes to 18.8, 19, 28. This is the true prevalence of inadequacy. And when you look at its close match with biochemical deficiencies, 15.7, 19.3, 14.4, this is kind of reassures that what we are thinking is actually true. And then what should be, I'm sorry for this spelling here, what should be the ideal approach to increase the intakes? Now let us say there is ER or the RDA or the, let us say if you are at the lower limit of intake, the best way is to push these intakes towards the ER and ensure that nobody crosses comes close to the TVL level. Set the target to achieve 50% dietary inadequacy and ensure exposure to TVL is very minimal, and also monitor the benefit and tox. And if these are this is a paper published in Journal of Nutrition by Dr. Amular's group. You see the dietary inadequacy in women of reproductive age against the old RDA. This is around 80 to 90%, but when you use the ER estimated from the current requirements, it is grossly close to 50%. And if you supplement with, now at least with current fortification standards, you're likely to cross the 10 mg, but if you take 10 mg as the input from the fortified foods, the inadequacy goes down very low, but at the same time, you start finding in few population groups, at least in few states, there is risk of inadequate intake. But if you use the 24 mg, that is coming from both supplementation of women of reproductive age, their IFA is supplemented, and 45, as well as their usual intake, we start seeing that across different states, the TVL, the risk of crossing the TVL is very, very high. And this you see in this state is 54%, which is very, very high. And we should, make sure that this practice is discouraged. And the implications of ICMR 2020 requirements are ER should always remain the population metric and not the RDA. And the goal of all nutrition programs together should be to shift the intake distribution close to the requirement distribution. That is to achieve 50% dietary adequacy or inadequacy. Considering large interstate variations, universal approach may not be feasible in many cases. And we should revise our approach based on dynamic and contemporary scientific evidence. There is nothing new that we are going to do. This is always being done, and we should do this again. Thank you, and these are the potential references. This is the ICMR 2020 book, which almost covers everything that I presented today. And I recommend all of you to read this particular review published in NFI Bulletin in 2015 and the contextualizing principles of iron fortification again in NFI Bulletin by Dr. Naik. Thank you so much, sir, and I'll be happy to. I just pasted some of the RDA and TL tables if somebody wants to refer later on, and I understand these slides will be shared with all of you. Thank you.
We can't hear you, you are muted.
Oh, sorry, sir. Thank you so much, Dr. Sir, for this insightful presentation. We'll be taking the questions. There are no questions yet from our people, from our audience. So, we'll be taking the questions maybe with our panelists. I think at that time, if you have some questions from the presentation, you can put it in the
Meena, can you please? We can't hear anything.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, Dr. Raghu, for your insightful presentation. The floor is open for questions. If anybody has any questions, you can just raise your hand. We can unmute and we can direct the questions to the speaker. As of now, we had one question in the Q&A box, but it says, yeah, we have a question from Sirimao Nair. A good presentation, Dr. Raghu. What is the basis for population evidence for new RDA?
I did not really understood the question, but
can we allow the participant to answer the question live? Richa, I think you can help with that.
Richa has to unmute. Ma'am, I'm not the participant. Attending, if we can elaborate the question in the Q&A box, then maybe we can.
I think the person who has question has to raise the hand, which will allow the host to enable them, unmute them.
yeah, as I understand, what is the basis for current RDA? I think the basis for current RDA is most of the basal losses were, the multiple studies were reviewed and all the values, it's coming from a lot of data. That's all I want to say. For many nutrients, we have even done the meta-analysis to arrive at the losses for factorial computation.
Yeah, I think it would be good if there was a little more specific. And I think is the question that do we have Indian data that is driving the requirements? I suspect that's what Sirima was trying to ask. I saw a hand up. So, Sirima, I think we do have Indian data for some of these, particularly in terms of energy, protein. For iron, we have partial Indian. I don't know if Sirima was trying to speak. Can someone unmute Sirima?
Richa only has to do that.
Well, we can't wait too long.
Unfortunately, yes. But there's another question, I think, from Meenakshi Shah. Maybe Dr. Tina, you can read it out.
Yes, ma'am. Like in the meantime, we can go to the next question. This is a question from Megha. Like, how do you see PULs impacting policies?
Yeah, I think all our policies will be aimed while increasing the adequacy. We will ensure they will help us to make sure that nobody, particularly in unsupervised settings, nobody crosses the period, so that the approach will be safer.
Thank you.
Then there is another question: which approach should be emphasized, dietary or drug-based? I think dietary is always, it's always a better approach compared to drug-based. But only if it is required a targeted, therapeutic approach may be considered, whether the benefits of treating that particular deficiency, like in terms of clinical symptoms, then possibly one can consider a therapeutic approach.
So we have one more question in the chat box. As per RTA 2020, do we need to revise Supplementary Nutrition Program of India?
Yes, of course, and I understand FSSAI is in the process of deriving the standards, but I have concerns that everybody use that standard. There will be multiple sources of fortified foods, which kind of overlaying multiple things, one on top of the other, may again lead to complications later on. So maybe one recommendation is needed, and that exercise I think is being done at FSSAI under the chairmanship of Dr. Nayak.
Can I help answering also in that? And I think Nair is doing a fantastic job setting fortification regulations. But the SMP program, I think the key is that we have to look at the gap that's there, particularly for children under 5 years or 6 years, 1 to 3 and then 3 to 6. And given that in the new RDAs or EARs, we spent a long time, Raghu, as you remember, trying to figure out the body weight patterns of Indian children. And indeed, we couldn't really get to a great value for that. So we used the WHO 50th percentile. And even with that, when we compare it with data of intakes of Indian children, which comes from NNMD, the gap is not 500 calories. It's about 250, 225 calories. The question then is, should the SMP be reduced to 500 calorie from 500 to 250 calories? That is the question of the year, because it is, I think, like a farm law. It is going to create a lot of problems. So I think I think it's a great question. It should be asked, but how it will be operationalized is difficult, not least because the National Food Security Act is a very strange act. It actually includes the amount of calories within the act as a number. That is very strange. So if you want to change that, you have to go back to Parliament and change the NFSA. So there's a lot of issues. I'll stop there.
Also, can I say something here? Yeah, I think the supplementary nutrition program is not a standardized one in terms of unifying in the entire country. Each state has their own type of ration or menu, so that makes it very complicated. So it has to be based on the balanced diet, what the NIN is actually coming out. I think that should be the basis for SMP.
Yes, sir. The emphasis also should the supplementary nutrition programs should aim possibly to, their dietary AMPR should be adjusted rather than just micronutrients, because they might not be taking a quality fat or protein. So if we can put more emphasis on increasing the quality of protein and the N3 N6 ratio along with the carbohydrate, while reducing the sugar, I think we will do a much better job than just adding micronutrients.
That is possible only if it's it's a pre-packaged food. Okay, these are all foods given to the centers, and they make their own supplements. So it's quite difficult to have a standardized for FSSI to prescribe something. We had many applications came to us, but the problem is they are not standardized to give a reference standard requirement for all these nutrients. It varies from state to state, so it is based on case to case. We are approving and giving that, and it is really very difficult to have for the entire country a single standard.
May I add something to this? What Dr. Nair is saying? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you can go.
Yes.
So just a little small exercise we had done, but that was before the COVID times, where we looked at the take-home rations, and the starting finding was basically the amount of energy they are trying to push into these take-home rations without actually looking at the AMTRs. So the simple sugar content and other things were really worrying. And since the prescription was standardized for a wide range of age group, so for the youngest one, it was looking as if it was pushing too much of carbohydrates and simple sugars into these formulations. So that is something we should look at and maybe have some kind of a targeted approach based on the age categories. I'll stop here. Thank you.
We have 2-3 questions. Madhavi Pandey posted a question could you please explain why RDA 2010 nutrient requirements reduced in RDA 2020 with an example, as you said, as per research study it was found?
No, I didn't find this question.
It's in the chat box.
What we can do is we can allow the participants to ask the questions. I would request Silma Nair, I think now she's...
Yeah, I think this question is RDA 2010 and 2020. Can you explain with an example? Sir, I already shown the iron as an example where the RDA is closer, isomer 2010 RDA is closer to isomer 2020 RDA, but both of them are lower with respect to EM.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ravi. I'm a person who works on field and still working on field rather. So there were a few discussions I was listening to. So let me put it 1 or 2 points which I wanted to discuss. First and foremost, when we are talking of high sugar into the SMP programs, I totally agree. But there were many recommendations given to the government that we should have a protein-rich formulation to be given to the children. 2 options were given. One was on Bengal gram and one was on green grams. So these 2 options were discussed widely, but the government said it was not cost effective. And therefore it did not get accepted, number one. Number two, based on that, had we increased the level of proteins to the kids, I think we would have come to a better level than only looking at micronutrients. Because if people are consuming good amount of protein, the micronutrients also would get absorbed if a good protein base is there. The first question which I asked was, what as population evidence do we have to say at this point of time, when we have rolled out the standards, that suddenly we want to change the RDA? I saw the presentations. Actually, I was traveling, but I saw the presentations. So these were 2 points I had in my mind. Thank you.
Sir, Nair sir, you want to answer that?
Well, regarding protein, yes, we are all looking for good quality protein. There is no doubt. But looking at the current recommendation, protein the requirement is only 10 to 15% of your energy should be come from protein. That means the total amount of protein what now currently recommended is much less than what it was earlier. So what is important is actually the quality of the protein. Yeah, doctor.
Yeah, exactly. That's what you said. We had 2 recommendations given. One was for Bengal gram because the density of the protein is good. And even if we cannot go for that, being little cost effective, we also suggested we go for green grams.
Now, can I just suggest that
Yes.
Karnataka policy in nutrition, we are now creating a pushti with 500 calories, and the problem was that there was no recommendation on fat given there. So here is the basic problem, that if you just take energy and protein requirement of children, actually the requirement is about 6%. It isn't even near 8 or 10% for normal growth, because there's so much energy that a child will eat. Now, if you then reduce the amount of energy coming from grains because you want to put oil in the food. So if you say 35% or 30% of the energy has to be fat, which comes from plant oils, which don't contain protein, then you have reduced your space to 2/3 of the energy, which should then carry the protein, in which case protein energy ratio becomes 8 to 9%. So there's a lot of variability here, and because the recommendation does not include anything about fat, people think that you can just take energy and protein without worrying about anything else. So that is the basic problem that we are having. If you are eating animal-based foods, fat and protein go hand in hand, like milk. That's the thing, egg, all these. So it is in a very vegetarian situation, you have to worry about these kinds of things. So I just want to say it's a little complex, but the fact is that the Karnataka state government is now using a process called linear programming, which is a method by which you can optimize a diet for about 15 nutrients using specified foods and come up with a THM. And that is called Pushti in Karnataka. And right now CFTRI is trying to make the flavors for that Pushti. It has 30% oil. And remember, this is post-Ukraine, when the cost of sunflower oil has gone to 200 rupees per liter. Still, we are able to make this within 6.8 rupees because 1.2 rupees is required for packaging and transport. Total 8 rupees. This is done, it is happening. So I want to tell you, it is not being rejected. The difference is that we are adding some defatted soya into the mixture because it's much cheaper. If oil price comes down, we don't need defatted soya. Thank you.
Can I come in, sir, here?
Yes, ma'am, please.
Yeah. Coming to this THR, there is proposal to reduce the calorie intake. Even though it is 400 or 500, it's not that the child will be eating all the amount that is given. So what happened here is we had a series of meetings with the Ministry of Consumer Affairs and the Food Distribution Department.
So here, instead of reducing the calories, we are improving the dietary diversity and improving the ratio of cereals versus pulses. We are saying that the cereal versus pulses will be 2:1 or 3:1, so that the required protein is achieved and the required essential fatty acids and essential amino acids are achieved in the THR. So when we calculated the calorie intake from cereals, refined cereals and sugar, it's actually going roughly around 70% for children, which is, disastrous. So by improving the legumes and pulses intake and by recommending some amount of peanuts, which comes relatively cheap compared to other nuts, what we did is when we did the linear programming calculation for this particular diet, it is achieving most of the essential micronutrients apart from achieving amino acids and essential fatty acids. So, sir, instead of reducing the calorie, we thought it would be wise to improve the dietary diversity and keeping in mind the AMDR, recommended AMDR. So that is what had done. And somebody asked why there is sudden change shift from 2010 RDA to 2020 EAR. Actually, it is not a sudden shift. EAR has been there for several decades, but we have adopted it very recently because now we have more recent data, and we had calculated under the chairmanship of Dr. M. Kevan and Dr. Kurpal, and it's not a sudden change. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So we'll go with the next question from Shobhana Ramdas. Even though year for reference man and women given, will the values differ for each and every individual with respect to his weight and age when we calculate for checking the nutrient requirements?
Yes, I think it's an interesting question. It does vary between individuals, but remember that these requirements are for a population. The requirements are given for a population. Therefore, if somebody wants to treat an individual, you have to consider all contextual factors, including the body weight, and adjust the doses accordingly.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Abner Daniel. Many or most supplementation programs in India self-select the vulnerable populations. Also, there are seasonal variations in intakes as well as shocks such as disruptions due to COVID. How can recommendations take this into account? Can this be justification for defining levels somewhere between EAR and RDAs?
Yeah, the seasonal variations does exist, and for some nutrients, these are requirements for a population where the intakes expected to vary throughout the year. So that's the reason the contextual differences should be, contextual factors should be considered when we have
Yes, can you all hear?
Sir, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think the requirements are requirements. That is for a normal population. You can't change that. That is what the problem, I think, as I see it here, is that if there are shocks, what will happen is that the intake will change with relevance to the requirement. So you may get populations that are deficient. Then yes, you can get, but you can't change the EAR. The EAR or the requirement is the same. What you're saying is that the gap changes. And then you have to do the appropriate program for that.
Thank you, sir. I think the question is clarified. Now we will go to the next question by Vijay Wadhwani. With the new RDA, any implications you see on the IFA supplementation program for adolescents?
Yeah, supplementation or therapeutic supplementation is a very different approach from RDAs and ERs. ERs and RDAs are requirements that are specified. They are not supposed to be supplemented at those levels. But IFA supplementation is very targeted to reduce a specific, improve a hemoglobin. Therefore, we should not, mix up things in interpreting the, RDA is not essentially to increase hemoglobin. It is to prevent the onset of anemia.
Thank you, sir. I request the participants, if they have any more questions, those can be posted in the Q&A box. Dr. Raghu can directly answer them in the Q&A box. Now we'll be moving forward to our panel discussion. I would like to introduce Dr. Hema Divakar ma'am. Like madam has been there right from our first webinar, and this is our 12th webinar today. And Dr. Hema comes with the same energy as always. And it's my privilege to introduce her. Madam is the chair for FIGO Well-Women Healthcare Committee. She's the medical director at Divakar Specialty Hospital, senior consultant gynecologist with over 3 decades of experience and expertise in women's healthcare. I request Dr. Hema to take over. Over to you, ma'am.
Namaskar, thank you, Tina. And it was just about 400 days ago that Bhartiji, Vani, and myself met and said we have to bring nutrition to the forefront and disseminate a lot of information between different stakeholders and our beloved audience. And we said once is not enough. So we met a dozen times, month after month, on the e-dialogue series. And as you have been told again and again, this is the 12th of the series, grand finale of the sort for the vision that we had for deliberation for a whole year. So once again, on behalf of all of us, thanking all our stakeholders and partners, we welcome all our beloved delegates, and it's indeed my proud privilege to introduce a very distinguished panel of speakers in this session. And keep your thinking caps on and the questions ready, because as Dr. Kurpat said, we come from the OBGYN clinicians space, and he mentioned first, second, third trimester, or first half of the pregnancy, or second half of the pregnancy, and so on and so forth, and lactation also being a very important period in the nutrition space. But dear friends, we must confess that we as clinicians have 2 constraints. The 2 C's are the time constraint for counseling and the thorough lack of understanding for calorie counts and calculations, and it's mind-boggling. And today's discussion so far with Raghuji making a brilliant presentation yet again brought us to the focus that the clinicians have not understood it all. So let's hear more from our distinguished panel, Dr. Suparna Ghosh, who is a professor and head community nutrition at the Public Health Foundation of India, with the areas of expertise in public health nutrition and implementation research, which is very, very crucial, because the gap between knowing and doing, that needs to be bridged by the lessons learned with the implementation research. She has worked as a consultant in Health, Nutrition and Family Welfare Division, and she served as the National Coordinator for the World Bank Assisted Capacity Building on Food and Drug Safety under the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India. Again, I underline and underscore, capacity building is so crucial, because there may be a demand out there, but unless the supply through the touch points of all the healthcare providers and the like, the capacities of disseminating the quality of information that is needed is so very crucial. So Suparna Ghosh is going to address us on a very important issue of assessing the nutritional inadequacies using the Nutrient Requirements 2022 values. So much of the science and mathematical confluence that you saw in Dr. Raghu's presentation. Her deliberation will be followed by yet another stalwart, Dr. K. Madhavan Nair, who is a scientist head at ICMR, Institute of Nutrition, Hyderabad, chair of the scientific panel on labeling and display FSSAI, and member of many committees and panels and groups at Food Safety and Standard Authority of India. He will be speaking to us on implications of Nutrient Requirements 2020, on the labeling regulations for packaged food and nutraceuticals. I must confess that all of us as clinicians, sir, are looking for a quick fix method. We may not understand much, but if there is a label and even the consumer figure out what's right, what is wrong. So I do hope that the deliberations by these two experts will throw more light into our understanding of doing the best for the population. So all yours, Suparnaji, to make your presentation on taking us further in our understanding.
Thank you, Dr. Hema. I'll share my screen. Is it visible?
Yeah, Suparnaji, if you can put it on full screen, that is, yeah.
Is this okay?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's fine.
All right. So, firstly, good afternoon, all, and I would like to thank Anayan and other partners for inviting me to this technical webinar series. And I can't agree more on this, that we need to strengthen maternal nutritional assessment in the context of their dietary and the nutritional intake with its correct interpretation. This is very crucial. And for this, we need standards, we need cutoffs that give us precise estimates on the level of dietary and nutritional inadequacies. What are we comparing our data with? We need to have something, the gold standard that we take should be well derived, should be evidence supported, and should be able to give us the right picture on the status of malnutrition in the country. This was especially true when we have a diverse range and level of malnutrition that we are presently seeing in our population, where on one hand, we might need to make sure that some sections of our population are not exposed to too much of nutrients in the presence of multiple food-based and nutritional supplementation strategies. Some of them are universal and which are being simultaneously implemented. And on the other hand, we have nutritionally vulnerable population who are finding it too hard to even fulfill their normal nutritional requirements despite all these interventions. So at this point, it is important to have correct estimates of the nutritional requirements of our population, and this will lead to better estimation of actual risk of nutritional deficiency amongst the different socioeconomic groups, levels of stratas of, population, keeping the cultural diversity and other contexts in mind, and accordingly inform policies. So this is the topic of my presentation, assessing nutritional inadequacies using the EAR 2020 values in reproductive age group women in the vulnerable communities of India. So this is the outline of my presentation, where I will be giving a background of the work that I have done and I'm doing with the vulnerable tribal communities of Jharkhand, how we used the new cutoffs for assessing the dietary intake and the nutritional intake of that population, especially using the new EARs for estimating the risk of nutritional inadequacy and discussing them in the context of our findings. So the data that I'm going to share with you is on the indigenous food study, where we have looked at the dietary diversity and nutritive value of indigenous foods in addressing food security and nutritional status in vulnerable tribal communities of India. And here, the research question we tried to address was that despite living in rich, biodiverse food environments, several of our indigenous communities, and despite focused programs for the tribal groups, the tribal welfare departments working with the health, with the Ministry of Women and Child Development, yet we are seeing such high levels of malnutrition, reported malnutrition in these communities. So where are we going wrong? So, or what are the possible factors that might be affecting the intake as well as its translation into nutritional status? So for that, our study objective was first to characterize the food environment, then assess the nutritive value of several nutritious indigenous foods these people are eating, which are perhaps also underutilized to some extent, and then the third objective is something which I'm going to present today, is estimating the contribution of these foods to nutrient intake and the nutritional status of the communities, especially women in the reproductive age group and children. And then informing the development of interventions to support indigenous food consumptions. And here we propose to use linear programming to make contextual solutions based on the information that we gathered from this particular population. So built on the sampling framework, because all these actually informed how we calculated the usual intake of the population. So we firstly, at the first level of sampling, we did a purposive selection of blocks which were inhabited by specific tribal groups. So we worked on 4 tribal groups, and we picked up purposively those blocks which had higher concentration of those tribal groups. And then we randomly picked up the villages and then the households in those villages which had women in the reproductive age group, but they were non-pregnant, and children in the age range of 6 months to 56 months to specifically look at their dietary intake profile. So we looked at the nutritional status assessment, and as we popularly use the term ABCD, we looked at the anthropometry, we looked at the dietary intake of this population, we did some biochemical assessments, and here we used some novel methods of undertaking multi-assays on a finger prick sample and looking at screening them for the common nutritional deficiencies, including vitamin A, iron, and also looking at some of the inflammatory biomarkers to adjust their values against those nutritional biomarkers. So now I will come to the focus of this presentation, which is the method of dietary assessment. Usually in nutrition, we use multiple methods and then triangulate the information to get a good representation of the diet that is being consumed by the population. Here we used a 2-day non-consecutive multi-pass 24-hour dietary recall method, but we did a lot of training and we did a lot of capacity building of the nutritionists who we were working together in order to get the exact picture of the diet that these communities were consuming. So the dietary recall required us to, elicit information on not only the food, not only the standard recipes, but exact recipes what they were consuming, so that we got a very accurate estimate of the raw foods that these communities were consuming. So we used food recall kits, portion size estimation kits, and others. The first important thing to get dietary intake data accurately is to get the right estimate. This was also, supported by a food frequency questionnaire, but for the purpose of calculating the usual dietary intake, we used this data. Now, the dietary intake were then converted into nutrient intake, and for that we used the Indian food composition tables and supplemented it with number of new foods that we identified, not new foods, but the indigenous foods for which we did not have the nutritive value in the IFCTs. We published all those specific values, added to the IFCT. This IFCT is adapted in a validated software which is called DietCal, and we used this particular software to calculate the actual raw food intake of the population. Again, a word of caution, we have the raw food composition table with us, so the nutrient retention factor is not being taken care of in our kind of estimation. So we just converted the raw food intake into the nutritive value, and we calculated the 2 days dietary intake converted to nutrient intake in our database. Now, at that point, we realized that these 2 days of estimates, and I was glad to see this term usual intake in Professor Raghu's presentation as well. And usual intake is something which is very crucial in case we want to compare it with the estimated average requirements or RDAs for that matter. Because when we talk about estimated average requirement or RDAs, we are talking about long-term consumption. So the long-term consumption of the population should be compared with their requirements, and that's why there was a reason to convert these 2 days dietary intake into usual intake.
So, and the reason is very evident that an individual does not have a constant dietary intake from day to day. His or her daily intake varies both in amount and the type of foods and drinks consumed. So, this is intra-individual variation. And the one-day dietary intake cannot reflect the true usual intake of the individual, and that is the reason why we do multiple days intake. However, even if we are doing multiple days intake, like average of 2 or 3 or even 7 days, would lead to a biased estimate as it omits within person variability by simply averaging out the consumption. So variation also, on top of this, variation also exists between persons in their nutrient intake averaged over time. So that is the inter-individual variation. So what do we do? The usual dietary intake is the long-term average daily intake of a nutrient or food. And why do we need usual intake? Because dietary recommendations are intended to be met over time, and diet health hypotheses are also based on dietary intakes over the longer period of time. Statistical modeling comes as a rescue for us here, and this has been used for years now in the nutrition community, where they have used statistical modeling to mitigate the limitations of 24-hour dietary recalls and derive usual intakes. One of the methods is given by the National Cancer Institute, NIH, where they are assessing the long-term average or usual dietary intake, which builds on the strength of 24-hour dietary recall and can also employ the food frequency questionnaires. The premise of the NCI method is that the usual intake is equal to the probability of consumption on a given day times the average amount consumed in a day. So there is a probability factor which is added to the day's intake of the population. So if you have 2 days intake, we'll add the probability factor and try to have a more representative nutrient intake or dietary intake for comparing it with EAI. And what is the statistical method? I won't get into the detail, but if the data is not normally distributed, they are first transformed, then the variance is reduced, and then they are back transformed to get the usual intake data. In simple language, we look at the data, we transform it, reduce the variance, and the outliers are sort of adjusted to come closer to the usual intake of the population, and accordingly we get a better estimate of the usual or the habitual intake of the population under question. So that usual intake is then compared with EAR, and that's what we did, and we did not compare it with RDA. Now, the reason why we did not do that has nicely been explained by Professor Raghu, and we just followed those guidelines, and as has been rightly pointed out by Dr. Hemalata, EAR has been there, the concept has been there. It's only for us that we did not adapt it, though for energy we had it for a long period of time. It's only for the other micro and macronutrients that we have now established EAR, and it is rational or normal, because when we are looking at the population level consumption and we are trying to understand how well the population is consuming, we are taking the mean of that population and comparing it with the RDA. We are not understanding that a major portion of that population is at the average level of intake. And when we are trying to, assess the adequacy of that diet, why not compare it with an estimated average requirement as compared to a value which might be used when we are talking about the desirable intake of the population. So when we are talking like this population must consume this amount of food, micronutrient or macronutrient, so that majority of the population are not at risk of deficiency, it's fine. But when the population has consumed the diet and we want to assess the dietary intake of the population, might as well consume it with the EAR, with the understanding that 50% of the population will be below that and 50% will be meeting that. And that is the EAR cut point method that we used. So yes, that is a kind of rationale. Now, if we look at another data set which has clearly shown how the various, micronutrients were assessed based on the 2 kinds of approaches, which is the EAR, the RDA, and the probability approach. What we found is with the probability approach, and that is what when we define the usual intake, we found that the levels were somewhat
not somewhat, but very close between the two. So if you see with the prevalence of inadequate intake with the probability approach as well as EARs, they were much, much closer. So why is EAR better to assess population nutrient adequacy? I have already explained. And EAR provides a good estimate of an individual's requirement, taking into account the net requirement and the absorption. The EAR cut point method yields a good estimation of the prevalence of inadequate intake and limits over as well as underestimation of the prevalence induced by the RDA. Hence, this approach to assessing nutrient intake is more informative than former method which relied solely on the recommended dietary allowances. So, we went ahead and did the assessment of the nutritional inadequacy or the risk of nutritional inadequacy of tribal women in Jharkhand. What we did was, for different nutrients, we used, if the distribution was skewed, which is true for iron especially, we used the probability approach method, and for the others, we used the EAR cut point method. The EAR cut point method, what does it do? It's after computing the usual intakes, which I've explained, the prevalence of nutritional inadequacy was estimated using this method, where we simply calculated the number of women with usual intakes of the nutrients below the EAR, and the proportion of women with usual intake below EAR were then considered as inadequate in terms of, were considered to be having nutritional inadequacy. So for the first tribal groups, which we did in 2019, and I remember contacting Dr. Kurpat about the EARs, and he said it's going to be published soon. So we used some kind of adjustment which was recommended in literature, where we considered 0.77. We multiplied the RDA values with a factor of 0.77 to get the EARs for our population. And for the EAR of iron, we used the study by Ghosh et al., which was shown by Dr. Raghu in his presentation, for looking at the EAR for iron. And then for the other two tribal groups, by that time, we had the EAR estimates available, EAR 2020 available, so we used them for assessment. For the probability method, on the other hand, it is not so simple, because again, it goes with the assumption that some of the nutrients are not distributed normally, and we just can't put EAR as the cut point and say percentage of people below are adequate, are inadequate, and percentage of people above EAR are adequate. So we use this particular probability approach, where you can see in this table, we use some standards given by Allen et al., wherein they gave for a particular percentage of bioavailability. Again, the iron estimation, if you remember the slides from Professor Prabhu, 10% bioavailability, there are some probability of inadequacies given. So at different levels, so we had women in the age group of 15 to 49. So those who were in the 15 to 17 years were put under this category, and those who were above 18, that is adults, were put under this category with 10% bioavailability. We said if somebody had an intake of 7.5 milligrams per day, has the probability of 1, which shows that yes, they are 100% at inefficiency, have inadequate intake. Whereas as the level of intake improved, we multiplied it with the probability of inadequacy to get the actual percentage of women who were inadequate. Adding the total gave us the level of inadequate intake, and unfortunately, our population is really impoverished and is not accessing the IFA supplementation, which is very much there, and the weekly supplementation is also there under the Anemia Mukt Bharat. But we hardly found them actually consuming that amount of iron through supplementation. But if we calculated the diet was grossly low in iron, and as a result of which, even if we would have used EAR cut point method, we would have had 100% population who were consuming less, and using the probability method also, we found the same results. So the nutrient inadequacy, or the risk of nutrient inadequacy in the three populations, you can see this was the work we published with the values which were calculated based on the RDA multiplying it with 0.77, except for iron, and we found, as you can see, most of the population was below the EAR for their particular age and physiological status. In all the three populations, we found that even using the EAR cut point method and the probability method, most of the micronutrients, most of the macronutrients, except for proteins, because they were eating a lot of rice, and here the question of protein quality comes. Like some of them were able to meet their protein requirements, but at the cost of quality. As you can see, around 25% were not protein inadequate, risk of protein inadequacy, but the rest were all at risk of protein.